Arnold Rothstein. The name drifts like cigar smoke through the alleys of New York in the early 1900s. A man who never fired a shot in anger, but who bent entire cities with his mind. He is remembered for one scandal above all, the fixing of the 1919 World Series, but to leave him there would be like staring only at the final chapter of a thick leather-bound book. His life, his rise, was not made in a single gamble. It was built brick by brick, coin by coin, on 1,000 small choices. Imagine the streets first. Horse-drawn carts clattering against cobblestones, the smells of pickled herring and roasted chestnuts drifting from corner vendors, the noise of immigrants haggling in half a dozen languages. New York was swelling, restless, raw. If you stood on Delancey Street in 1890, you'd see the faces of the tired and the hungry, men with their caps low, women carrying baskets, children darting like shadows. Somewhere among them, young Arnold walked, dressed better than most, already cultivating the habit of being noticed. His father, Abraham Rothstein, was a wealthy businessman and a stern man of faith. He wanted his son to walk a straight road, a respectable Jewish boy, educated, disciplined, upright. Arnold, though, looked down every alley that veered away from that path. The smell of card games, the shine of dice tumbling across tables, the nervous laughter of men risking their week's pay. These things pulled at him stronger than synagogue hymns ever could. They called him the brain for good reason. He was never the biggest man in the room, nor the loudest, but his eyes were sharp, and his mind was sharper still. When other boys were distracted by women or drink, Arnold studied odds. He could walk into a room, watch a game for 10 minutes, and leave with an exact calculation of who was cheating, who was desperate, and who would fold first. Numbers were his scripture. Probability was his prayer. By the time he was in his 20s, Rothstein wasn't playing games. He was running them. Poker rooms, horse races, bookmaking schemes. Where others chased luck, he manufactured it. He learned how to grease the right palms, how to talk to cops without talking too much, how to make debts vanish or multiply depending on the man in front of him. Every step deeper into the city's underworld felt, to Arnold, like stepping closer to where he belonged. And then came baseball. America's game, pure, clean, untouchable, or so it was thought. To a man like Rothstein, though, nothing was untouchable. He saw ball players like he saw every gambler, hungry, underpaid, and willing to risk honor if the price was right. In 1919, the Chicago White Sox entered the World Series as heavy favorites. By the end, they were disgraced forever, accused of throwing the games for cash. The whispers pointed to one man orchestrating the fix, Arnold Rothstein. But here's where history blurs with fiction, where the alleyways of fact and rumor twist together. Did Rothstein really plan it all, pulling strings like a patient puppeteer? Or did he simply lean back in his chair, cigar smoldering, and let desperate men come to him? The newspapers painted him as the spider in the center of the web, calm while the city thrashed around him. But in the quiet of the night, when the streets finally grew still, what did he hear? Was it victory, or the faint scratch of fate marking down his name for judgment? We will walk slowly with him, through backroom gambling halls lit by flickering bulbs, through the roar of Yankee Stadium crowds, through the smell of damp cash counted behind closed doors. We will watch him climb, and we will watch him fall. Not quickly, not all at once, but piece by piece, until even the brain found that the odds he had mastered so long ago were beginning to turn against him. The year was 1882 when Arnold Rothstein was born in New York City, second son to Abraham and Esther Rothstein. The house he grew up in was quiet, respectable, filled with the smell of polished wood and books of prayer. His father, Abraham, was known as a strict man, successful in business, proud of his heritage, and determined that his sons would live straight, honest lives. But children, no matter how carefully watched, find cracks in the walls built for them. Arnold was not like his older brother, who listened obediently, studied his scripture, and walked the expected road. Arnold had restless eyes. Even as a boy, when he should have been memorizing lines from the Torah, his mind would wander to the games other boys played on the street. Dice, marbles, coins flipped high and caught with a snap. These little games were not just fun to Arnold, they were lessons. He studied the way boys reacted when they lost, the way they held their breath when chance hung in the air. He began to see something his father did not, that men were not ruled by faith alone, or even by logic, but by their hunger to win and their fear of losing. By the time he was 10 years old, Arnold had already begun to gamble, not with money at first, but with marbles, small trinkets, pieces of candy. He rarely lost. His older brother once told him, half in admiration and half in warning, "Arnold, you think too much. One day you'll outsmart yourself." But Arnold only smiled. To him, thinking was survival. As the 1890s rolled in, New York City was a roaring beast of noise and growth. The streets were alive with pushcarts, horse-drawn wagons, and crowds of immigrants speaking Italian, German, Yiddish, Irish slang, a chorus of ambition and desperation. The Lower East Side, in particular, was a furnace of struggle, where families squeezed into cramped tenements, and every corner seemed to hold a fight, a bargain, or a prayer. Arnold grew fascinated by the rhythm of these streets. He noticed things others overlooked, which shopkeeper allowed credit and which demanded cash, which policemen turned a blind eye to certain boys, which gamblers always seemed to leave a card game richer than they arrived. Knowledge was currency, and Arnold hoarded it. It was around this time that he began slipping into pool halls and backroom card games. At first, older men laughed at the skinny boy with slicked back hair who wanted to sit at their tables. But after a while, the laughter stopped. He played not with emotion, but with a cold patience that unsettled men twice his age. He rarely smiled, rarely cursed, rarely showed anger at a loss. He simply studied the cards, studied the men, and then won. It was here that Arnold earned the beginnings of his nickname. Not yet the brain, but something close. Men started saying, "Watch out for that Rothstein kid. He don't play cards, he plays people." At home, his father grew worried. Abraham believed gambling was poison, a road that led to ruin. He urged his son to leave the games behind, to focus on school and on the family's good name. But Arnold, even then, had learned how to dodge questions, how to keep his nights hidden. He would sit at dinner, eating in silence, while his father lectured about honesty, about faith, about dignity. And in Arnold's pocket, folded tight, there would be the winnings from a card game played only hours before. It was not the money that thrilled him. Money was useful, yes, but what Arnold loved was the control. Watching a man grow desperate, then calm, then desperate again, all because of the fall of a card. It was like holding the strings of a puppet. And Rothstein, even as a boy, dreamed of being the one who pulled the strings in a city full of puppets. The streets taught him more than school ever could. Numbers mattered, yes, but faces mattered more. And as he walked home through the smoky glow of gas lamps, hearing the city's restless hum, Arnold Rothstein carried inside him the beginnings of the man he would become. A gambler, a fixer, a quiet storm that would one day shake the very heart of America's favorite game. The city was always moving. That was the first truth Arnold Rothstein carried into manhood. By the time he was 16, New York seemed less like a home and more like a living machine, breathing steam and grinding its gears day and night. Streetcars rattled on their tracks, bells clanged, and hawkers shouted their prices until their throats cracked. The air was never still. Even at night, when the lamps burned low and most decent families had gone to bed, there was movement. Figures slipping through alleys, doors opening quietly to admit men who had nowhere else to go. It was in these hours that Arnold felt most alive. He had grown into a thin young man, not imposing in size, but neat in appearance. He wore pressed clothes whenever he could afford them, shoes polished until they caught the faintest glow of the gaslights. Respectability was armor, he had already decided. A man could move further if he looked like he belonged in any room. And so, while his father dreamed of him becoming a scholar or a businessman in some safe, honorable trade, Arnold was spending his nights in billiard halls and gambling rooms. He had mastered the art of slipping past suspicion. To some, He was still just Abraham Rothstein's boy, quiet, clever, a touch aloof. But to others, he was a presence at the tables, a sharp-eyed young gambler who seemed to know when to press forward and when to fold back. It started with pool. The game wasn't just about angles and force. It was about patience. Arnold could stand there, cue in hand, and watch his opponent's nerves fray as silence stretched. Men lost more games to their own anxiety than to bad shots, and Rothstein understood this instinctively. He became known as a player who rarely missed, but more importantly, as one who never cracked. He didn't grin when he sank a ball, didn't curse when he missed. He played like a man counting heartbeats. But pool alone wouldn't make him rich. Cards, though. Cards held the real promise, poker especially. In those smoke-thickened rooms, where whiskey flowed and tempers ran hot, Arnold honed his craft. He wasn't the kind of gambler who thrived on luck. In fact, he seemed almost contemptuous of men who believed in it. Luck runs out, he once told an acquaintance, but brains don't. It was here that people began to call him the Brain. At first it was half a joke, but the name stuck because it fit. He studied everything, the way men shuffled their feet under the table, the way a man's hand trembled when he bluffed, the flicker of pride or fear in an eye when a card was laid down. He carried no pistol, made no threats, yet men feared him all the same. Not because he might hurt them, but because he could ruin them without raising his voice. By the age of 21, Rothstein was already running games rather than just playing them. He had built small circles of men willing to stake money, not just for the thrill, but because they believed the games were safe under his watch. Safety was a commodity in New York's gambling world. Crooked dealers, rigged dice, stacked decks, they were everywhere. But with Arnold in charge, the games ran smooth. Not fair, perhaps, but smooth. A man could lose his week's wages and still walk out alive, which wasn't always guaranteed in other halls. It was around this time that Rothstein began to cross paths with men who mattered in New York's underworld. The city was a patchwork of gangs, politicians, and businessmen, all overlapping in ways that outsiders couldn't quite see. Tammany Hall, the political machine that ruled much of the city, relied on these networks. Votes were bought, favors exchanged, protection offered. And gambling was woven through it all. Arnold wasn't a street brawler. He had no interest in joining gangs that solved disputes with fists and knives. He admired power, but he despised noise. Instead, he began to make himself useful to the men who actually pulled the levers, the bookmakers, the ward bosses, the fixers. He lent money, quietly at first, then in larger sums, made introductions, he vouched for games. He began, in short, to operate like a man who understood that influence, not violence, was the real currency of power. One story that survives from these years tells of Rothstein backing a horse race. He'd studied the odds, studied the horses, and more importantly, studied the jockeys. When the race ended just as he predicted, his winnings were modest compared to the satisfaction of having read the entire event like a book. "The horses run," he supposedly said afterward, "but it's the men who ride them that tell the story." It was a lesson he never forgot. Control the human element, and the rest falls into place. At home, though, there was tension. His father, Abraham, grew increasingly dismayed. Gambling to him was sin dressed as entertainment, a trap for weak men. He confronted Arnold more than once, warning that dishonesty and greed would end in ruin. But Arnold, with his calm manner and carefully chosen words, often turned the conversations aside. He never raised his voice to his father, never openly rebelled. He simply lived a double life, dutiful son in daylight, calculating gambler by night. As the new century moved forward, America itself was changing. The country was swelling with ambition, with inventions, with new fortunes made in steel and oil. And yet beneath that glittering surface, vice flourished. New York in particular was a city of contradictions, respectable by day, but teeming with gambling, drinking, and corruption by night. For men like Rothstein, it was a paradise. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Arnold was more than a gambler. He was becoming a financier of vice. He put money behind pool halls, card rooms, horse races. He lent cash to men who couldn't get it from banks. And he did it all quietly. cultivating the image of a respectable businessman while building a reputation in the shadows. One detail sets him apart from many others in the underworld of his day. He almost never drank. While other men staggered from saloons, Arnold sipped soda water or tea. He distrusted alcohol, believing it dulled the senses and weakened judgment. To him, self-control was the sharpest weapon a man could wield. It gave him an edge over rivals who let their tempers or appetites betray them. He also avoided violence. Not because he was soft, he was not, but because he saw it as messy, unpredictable, and unnecessary. Guns could silence men, but silence alone wasn't enough. What Arnold wanted was obedience, trust, dependence. He wanted men to come back to him again and again, tied not by fear, but by the invisible chains of debt and need. And so, quietly, steadily, he grew. A young man with no factory, no warehouse, no obvious empire. And yet an empire was exactly what he was building. One wager at a time, one loan at a time, one quiet arrangement with a crooked politician at a time. The city knew his type, of course. New York had always produced gamblers and hustlers. But Rothstein was different. He carried himself with the calm assurance of a banker, not a thug. He wore tailored suits, walked with dignity, spoke in low tones. He was not a street rat, but a chess player, moving his pieces across the board while others thought they were playing checkers. And as whispers of his skill spread, so too did the sense that he was destined for something larger. Poker games and horse races were stepping stones. The real prize lay beyond. Politics, big business, maybe even the great American pastime itself, baseball. But that was still to come. For now, in these years of early adulthood, Arnold Rothstein was sharpening his tools: patience, calculation, influence. The boy who once gambled for marbles on a crowded street had grown into a man who could read the city like a card hand, who could see not just the game in front of him, but the game 3 steps ahead. The nights were long, filled with smoke, dice, whispers, and deals. Yet Arnold seemed tireless, as if he drew energy not from sleep, but from the pulse of the city itself. When others faltered, when debts piled high or tempers boiled over, Rothstein remained steady, a figure of quiet control in a world of chaos. Men who played against him often left shaking their heads, muttering that he must have some secret, some trick. But Arnold would only smile faintly and light another cigar. He had no secret, not in the way they imagined. He simply understood people, understood that fear, greed, and hope were stronger than any card in the deck. It was this understanding, more than luck or money, that was making him powerful. And it was this same understanding that would one day draw him into the scandal that made him infamous, the scandal that still echoes through history, the fixing of the 1919 World Series. But that, too, lay ahead. For now, the young Rothstein walked steadily through the smoke and the shadows, his pockets growing heavier, his reputation spreading wider, and his mind always calculating the next move. The city had grown familiar to him, but never comfortable. Comfort was for men who lost their edge, who stopped paying attention, and Arnold Rothstein would never allow himself that mistake. By his late 20s, he had carved a place in New York's hidden circles, though it was not yet the empire he dreamed of. He was known by name in the dimly lit card rooms uptown and in the smoke-choked halls of the Lower East Side. His reputation was not built on brawls or outbursts, but on his unshakable composure, the way he could sit through an entire night of gambling without once betraying impatience or fatigue. Men said he could play poker for 3 days without blinking. Perhaps it wasn't true, but the legend was useful. He learned early that a man's image was worth more than gold. A well-cut suit, a pressed shirt, a calm expression, these were his weapons. When others showed up smelling of sweat and whiskey, Arnold arrived neat and measured, as if he had all the time in the world. People began to assume he knew more than he said, that he carried secrets the rest of them would never understand. That was exactly the impression he wanted. Money came faster now. The small stakes of his teenage years had given way to games where thousands of dollars shifted hands in a single night. He lent to men who had lost too much, and unlike most loan sharks, he didn't need to threaten. His manner, so polite and businesslike, made debtors more afraid than a gun ever could. They paid because they knew that failing him would quietly close doors all over the city. A man in debt to Rothstein could not get a seat at a card table, could not get backing for a horse bet, could not buy his way into the games that mattered. He understood that power was not in the fist, but in the network. Still, there were risks. Once, a bookmaker tried to cheat him on a horse race, thinking the quiet young gambler would swallow the loss. Arnold didn't argue. He let the man leave with his trick winnings. A week later, though, the bookmaker found no one would take his action. Every gambler, every runner, every small-time fixer turned their backs. It was as if the man had been erased from the city. Only then did he understand that Rothstein's revenge was not loud but permanent. The man came crawling back, begging to make amends. Arnold accepted, but only on terms so punishing that the bookmaker never dared cross him again. This was how he expanded, without shouting, without bloodshed. He began to buy into pool halls and gambling dens, not just as a player, but as part owner. His money circulated like blood, feeding places that in turn fed him. In a city where most men rose quickly and fell even faster, Rothstein was the rare figure who only moved upward, step by patient step. Yet the life he built was not without shadows. His father, Abraham, grew bitterly disappointed as his son's path became clearer. There were arguments at the family table, quiet but cutting. Abraham wanted a scholar, a businessman in the clean sense of the word, not this gambler who lived by dice and cards. Arnold listened respectfully, nodded at the right moments, but inside he dismissed it all. His father's world was old, rigid, bound by rules that no longer mattered. The new century belonged to men who could bend rules until they snapped. There were nights when Arnold walked alone through the city, his mind restless. The lamps glowed over slick pavement, streetcars clattered in the distance, and somewhere a saxophone played in a basement club. He thought of himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman of the future. The banks would never lend to immigrants, to gamblers, to hustlers. Yet, he lent. The system excluded those who lived by chance and vice, yet he gave them order. In his own cold way, he saw himself as filling a need, giving structure to chaos. It was in these years that he also discovered the value of politics. Gambling did not exist in isolation. It lived in the cracks of the city, protected or destroyed by the men in Tammany Hall. Rothstein learned how to talk to ward bosses, how to quietly pass envelopes, how to make promises that bound men more tightly than contracts. He never ran for office, never sought public attention, but he made sure politicians remembered his name when favors were asked. His restraint set him apart. Other men drank themselves into ruin. Others wasted fortunes chasing women or bragging about their winnings. Arnold stayed cool, never raising his voice, never showing off. His only indulgence was fine clothes and good cigars. He wanted to look the part of a man above the streets, a man who could step into a banker's office and not seem out of place. Appearance was more than vanity. It was armor, and he wore it every day. The turning point of these years came with horses. Horse racing was the great passion of gamblers, and the money it drew dwarfed poker or pool. Arnold began placing larger bets, and soon he wasn't just betting. He was manipulating. He studied trainers, jockeys, even the conditions of tracks. He lent money to riders and made quiet arrangements. A horse didn't need to win for him to profit. It only needed to run as expected. And when the race played out exactly as his odds predicted, his reputation grew sharper still. Some say it was around this time that he first began to dream of bigger games, games that touched the very heart of American life. He had fixed races, guided poker hands, even controlled entire halls. But baseball was holy. If he could reach into that sacred space, he would not just be a gambler, he would be a legend. The thought lingered at the edges of his mind, not yet a plan, but a possibility waiting for its hour. For now, though, he stayed patient. He invested his winnings, spread his influence, and built his name brick by brick. In the city's underworld, Men came and went like smoke, but Arnold Rothstein remained, steady, precise, always watching, always calculating. The boy who once tossed marbles on a dusty street had become the quiet storm moving beneath New York's glittering surface. And everyone who played against him, or borrowed from him, or tried to cross him, learned the same lesson in time. The brain never forgot, and the brain never forgave. The years rolled on, and with each season, Arnold Rothstein moved further away from being just another gambler and closer to becoming something more dangerous, more influential. The city had changed around him. New York was buzzing with electricity now, street lamps glowing brighter, telephones multiplying in offices and homes, skyscrapers beginning to bite into the sky. But beneath all this shine, the same old hunger thrived. Men still wanted to bet, to take a chance, to believe they could outwit the odds. And as long as that hunger lived, Rothstein had work to do. By his early 30s, his name carried a weight that could be felt in both smoky backrooms and well-lit restaurants. He no longer needed to hustle for a seat at a card table. He no longer needed to argue his way into a racetrack deal. The doors opened for him because people understood he had something most men lacked: patience and brains. And he used those patiently, always stretching his influence a little further without rushing. The horse tracks had been good to him, and not just for the money. They taught him that no sport, no event, was ever as pure as it looked from the outside. Jockeys could be persuaded, trainers could be compromised, owners could be leaned on. He didn't need to control every detail, just enough to tilt the scales. A half-second delay at the start, a horse eased up slightly on the final turn, a jockey willing to hold back for a price. Little shifts, invisible to the cheering crowds, but enough to make fortunes in the shadows. That lesson, that everything could be influenced, everything had a price, sat at the center of Rothstein's philosophy. And it was this philosophy that led him naturally toward baseball. Baseball wasn't just a sport in America, it was a faith. Men went to the ballparks the way their fathers had gone to churches. The newspapers called the players heroes, clean and noble, men who embodied the American spirit. But Rothstein saw past the mythology. He saw tired, underpaid athletes, men who lived harder lives than the public ever imagined. Owners grew rich while players barely scraped by, bound by contracts that kept them trapped. In those cracks, Arnold saw opportunity. The 1910s were years of war, of upheaval, of shifting fortunes. While soldiers fought overseas, the gamblers kept working at home. Prohibition was just around the corner, promising to reshape the underworld in ways no one yet imagined. But in 1919, before the first wave of bootlegging and speakeasies, came the chance that would define Rothstein's life: the World Series. The Chicago White Sox were the team to beat, strong, disciplined, and favored by nearly everyone. But inside that clubhouse there was discontent. Players felt cheated by their owner, Charles Comiskey, who was notorious for stinginess. Their wages were low compared to the wealth the team was generating. Their loyalty, worn thin, was ripe for exploitation. Rothstein, listening to whispers carried through the gambling world, began to understand that some of these men might be willing to do the unthinkable: throw games, if the price was right. The idea wasn't entirely his. Rumors suggest a group of gamblers approached him with the scheme, hoping he would finance it. They needed money, big money, to pay off the players and make the fix stick. Rothstein didn't leap at the chance. He was cautious, weighing risks. If the plan failed, if the fix was exposed, it could destroy him. But the temptation was irresistible. To reach into America's sacred game, to control the very outcome of the World Series. That was power beyond anything he had touched before. He considered it the way he considered a hand of cards, not as a matter of luck, but of calculation. The players were desperate enough, the gamblers were greedy enough, the public, blinded by faith in the purity of the sport, would never see it coming. The more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And so, in quiet meetings in hotel rooms and restaurants, arrangements began to take shape. Joes and Eddies, pitchers and infielders, men who should have been focused on glory, were instead focused on envelopes of cash. Rothstein didn't always deal directly. He preferred layers, buffers, men between him and the players. If the scheme unraveled, he could deny, distance himself, slip back into the shadows. But the money? The money flowed from his hand into theirs, cold and convincing. The World Series of 1919 began with expectation thick in the air. Crowds roared, newspapers swelled with headlines, and across America, men placed bets, confident they were watching a contest as fair as the sunrise. But behind every swing of the bat, behind every misstep on the field, Rothstein's invisible hand was guiding events. The Sox lost games they should have won. Errors appeared that didn't look like errors at all. Pitchers grooved balls straight over the plate. At first, suspicion flickered at the edges of the crowd's mind, but it was hard to believe. Baseball was pure. Baseball was untouchable, wasn't it? When the Cincinnati Reds finally claimed victory, some fans celebrated while others scratched their heads. But in the smoky corners of gambling dens, in whispers on city streets, the word spread. The series had been fixed, and the man at the center of it all, the one who had made it happen, was Arnold Rothstein. He didn't gloat. He never gloated. When asked, he denied involvement, as calm as ever. To the press, he was simply a businessman, a man of culture, no different from any other well-dressed figure in New York's restaurants. He never raised his voice to insist on his innocence. He didn't need to. His composure was defense enough. And though suspicion lingered, no jury ever convicted him, no courtroom ever held him accountable. The fix became legend, and Rothstein's name grew larger, not smaller. But with that legend came something else, an aura of danger. If he could fix the World Series, what couldn't he fix? Men who had once dismissed him as just another gambler now spoke of him with respect and fear. Politicians looked at him differently. Police officers hesitated before crossing him. His influence stretched further than it ever had. Still, not all debts were easy to collect. Some of the gamblers involved in the fix argued over the money, accusing one another of betrayal, of skimming, of not delivering what was promised. Violence followed, small but sharp, rippling through the underworld. Rothstein kept his distance, as always, but he watched carefully. He knew that even the cleanest fix left stains, and so he adjusted, grew more careful, more insulated. He built layers of protection, men who could be sacrificed if things went wrong, fronts that could be burned without touching him. The series had given him power, but it had also taught him caution. He had played with America's sacred toy and gotten away with it. But he would not be foolish enough to think the game could be repeated without risk. In the years after the scandal, Rothstein walked the city with a new weight in his step. He was still calm, still polite, still tailored in his suits. But beneath that calm ran the awareness that he had crossed a line. He was no longer just a gambler, no longer just a financier of small vices. He was something larger, something that cast a longer shadow. The crowds at the ballpark never knew his face. The families who bought tickets, who cheered for their heroes, never realized the man in the tailored suit smoking his cigar in a restaurant uptown had once tugged the strings that made their beloved game dance. But Rothstein knew. And knowing was enough. The city's underworld began to shift again, preparing for the coming tide of prohibition when alcohol itself would become the greatest gamble of all. Rothstein was ready. The World Series had shown him the reach of his influence, the limits of his caution, the power of money when applied with precision. He had fixed a dream and lived to tell it. Now he turned his eyes toward the next game, the bigger game, the endless game of power itself. The scandal of 1919 did not fade easily. Newspapers hammered at it, fans whispered about it, and the purity of baseball was forever stained. But like all scandals, it became, in time, a story rather than a storm. Players were disgraced, investigations opened, names dragged through the mud. Yet Arnold Rothstein remained untouched. He was never convicted, never formally tied to the fix. To the world at large, he was just another businessman in fine suits, a man who dined in the best restaurants and spoke in a low, even voice. But inside New York's underworld, everyone knew the truth. They knew he had been the invisible hand behind the series, and in that knowledge was both fear and respect. Few men in America could say they had reached into the heart of the nation's most beloved game and bent it to their will. Arnold Rothstein had done it and walked away clean. This new aura clung to him. Some men feared it would bring him ruin, that too much attention would fall on him. Others saw it as proof that he was untouchable. Rothstein, as always, revealed little of what he felt. He walked calmly through the city, playing cards, backing horses, lending money. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, though, he understood that the world had shifted. He had crossed a threshold. He was no longer a clever gambler operating in shadows. He was a figure of power, and power demanded new rules. The timing of this transformation could not have been better for him. America was stumbling into prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. The lawmakers who passed it believed they were saving the country from vice. Instead, they handed men like Rothstein a golden opportunity. Overnight, alcohol was no longer a simple commodity. It was contraband. And contraband meant fortunes for those willing to risk moving it. Speakeasies popped up on every block, hidden behind false doors and guarded by passwords. Men who had never considered themselves criminals now found themselves sneaking into backrooms to sip gin or whiskey. Demand exploded, and with demand came profit. Rothstein was not the kind of man to run a speakeasy himself. That was too small, too visible, too dirty. Instead, he placed himself above it, orchestrating the flow of liquor like a general directing troops. He financed shipments, paid for warehouses, arranged connections with bootleggers. His money smoothed the way across borders, bought silence from officials, and kept product moving through the veins of the city. Ships came in heavy with Canadian whiskey. Trucks rumbled down back roads with crates hidden under tarps. Police officers looked the other way, their pockets heavier after quiet visits. It was a sprawling, chaotic business, but Arnold brought order to it. He didn't drink himself, never touched the liquor he moved, but he understood better than anyone that alcohol was not just drink, it was power. And with alcohol came new men, hungry men. The gangs of New York swelled with recruits, Italians, Irish, Jews, all carving out territories fighting for turf. Blood ran in alleys, knives flashed in dim corners, pistols barked in the night. Men like Charles, Lucky Luciano, and Meyer Lansky were climbing fast, building networks that would one day define organized crime in America. Rothstein was older than these men, calmer, more calculating. They looked to him not as a rival, but as a teacher. He became a mentor to many of the young mobsters who later rose to fame. They studied his methods, the way he kept violence at arm's length, the way he let others fight while he financed and profited, the way he always appeared respectable. To them, Rothstein was proof that crime didn't have to look like crime. A man could sit in fine restaurants, wear silk ties, and still control the flow of millions in illegal trade. Yet for all his influence, he kept himself apart from the noise. He rarely raised his voice, never swaggered, never boasted. When others were drunk on money and blood, Arnold sat quietly, counting, planning. He lent money to gangsters and businessmen alike, knowing that debt bound them to him more tightly than fear ever could. They called him the Brain, and the name fit better with each passing year. But the city was dangerous. Prohibition had unleashed violence on a scale New York had never seen. Gangs fought with bombs and Tommy guns, turning streets into battlegrounds. Rothstein avoided the front lines, but he was not blind. He saw that the world of gambling and liquor was growing more volatile. He made sure to keep his hands clean, leaving the blood to others. Still, there were moments when the shadows crept closer than he liked. One evening, a young gangster came to him begging for a loan. Rothstein, as usual, listened politely, weighed the odds, and gave his answer. The man, frustrated and drunk, muttered threats under his breath. Arnold didn't flinch. He simply dismissed the man, as if brushing away a piece of lint. Days later, the gangster vanished. Some whispered that Rothstein had ordered it. Others said the man had crossed someone else. Rothstein never commented, and the city never asked too loudly. This was how he lived, untouchable on the surface, yet always one wrong step away from danger. The Black Sox scandal had shown him how far he could reach, but Prohibition was teaching him how high the stakes truly were. Money poured in faster than ever. His influence stretched beyond New York, touching Chicago, Philadelphia, even further. But with every dollar came more enemies, more desperate men, more eyes watching him. At home, his life was a strange mixture of quiet and distance. He married Carolyn Green, a woman of elegance. Though their relationship was never warm, he kept his emotions guarded, even with her. His life was his business, and his business was everything. Friends were few, trusted allies fewer still. He preferred it that way. In his world, closeness was weakness. Yet for all his caution, for all his brains, Rothstein carried inside him a gambler's heart. He could never resist the draw of the game itself. Poker remained his true love. Nights stretched into mornings at tables where fortunes changed hands in minutes. He didn't play like others, with sweat on their brows and curses on their lips. He played like a man solving a puzzle, his face calm, his hands steady. He lost sometimes, but never enough to matter. What he won was more than money. It was the respect, the fear, the knowledge that men left his table knowing they had been measured and found wanting. The Black Sox scandal lingered in memory, but Prohibition had eclipsed it now. America was drowning in liquor, and Rothstein was helping pour the drinks. He knew it couldn't last forever. The government would push back, the public would grow tired of the bloodshed, laws would change. But until that day came, he would ride the wave, not recklessly, not loudly, but steadily, always calculating the odds. In the end, what defined him was not luck, nor brute force, but patience. He could wait longer than anyone. He could let others rush into battles, let others spill blood, let others take the fall. He simply remained, quietly building, quietly pulling strings, quietly becoming one of the most powerful figures in America's hidden history. And yet, as his influence spread, so too did the whispers of his downfall. Even the smartest gambler cannot play forever without eventually facing a hand he cannot control. Arnold Rothstein knew this, though he rarely admitted it aloud. Perhaps that is why he played so hard, why he lent so widely, why he reached so far. Somewhere deep down, he must have known that the game would not last forever. But for now, in those years after the World Series and at the height of Prohibition, he walked the city with quiet confidence. The crowds in speakeasies laughed and sang, the police counted their bribes, the gangsters fought their bloody wars. And above it all sat Rothstein, the brain, calm and watchful, turning chaos into profit one careful move at a time. He sat in the corner of the restaurant like he always did, back against the wall, cigar between his fingers, eyes calm but never idle. The tables around him were alive with chatter, the clink of glasses, the low laughter of men and women who thought the night belonged to them. But Rothstein never thought of nights as belonging to anyone. They were borrowed, rented, fleeting. What mattered was who could control the day after. By the mid-1920s, his name had become something whispered with weight, not shouted like a gangster's nickname, not splashed across newspapers like a politician's scandal. Quiet, careful weight. Arnold Rothstein, the brain. He wasn't a brawler, wasn't the kind of man to bark orders with a gun on the table. Instead, he was the man you went to when you needed things arranged, when you needed money, when you needed introductions, when you needed the impossible to look like it had been planned all along. And it was precisely this quality that drew the younger generation of mobsters to him. Charles, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, the names that would one day rule the underworld, were still young men then, hungry, reckless, ambitious. They admired Rothstein not for his age or his wealth alone, but for the way he made crime look like business. They had grown up around street gangs, turf fights, and quick money. But Rothstein showed them a different path, a path where violence was the last resort, where the real power lay in connections, financing, and patience. Luciano, brash and charming, learned quickly that Rothstein's calm presence was not to be mistaken for softness. Lansky, sharp-eyed and mathematical, saw in Rothstein a reflection of what he wanted to become. They began visiting him, not always as protégé, but as students who recognized a master. Rothstein didn't preach or give speeches. He taught by example. A few quiet words at a table, a single raised eyebrow at the right moment, a story told not with drama, but with precision. He told them once, as they sat in a back room over coffee instead of liquor, "Violence gets you enemies. Debt gets you servants. Remember that." Luciano repeated it years later as if it were scripture. To Rothstein, this wasn't wisdom. It was fact, the kind of rule you could rely on as firmly as gravity. These young men were the future, and Rothstein knew it. The old gangs with their knives and their fists were dying out. Prohibition had changed the landscape, creating opportunities that demanded organization and discipline. Rothstein had no illusions about his own place. He wasn't immortal. He wasn't destined to sit on a throne forever, but he could shape what came after him. And in shaping it, he could ensure that pieces of himself, his methods, his philosophy, lived on. But while he guided them, he never let them forget who held the purse strings. He bankrolled deals, arranged shipments, smoothed introductions to men in politics and police. When Luciano needed capital for a venture, it was Rothstein's money that gave him a start. When Lansky sought to expand his operations, Rothstein's influence opened doors, and they never forgot the cost. His loans were not charity. They were chains, invisible but strong. The city, though, was restless. Prohibition had filled it with easy money and hard violence. Gangs warred in the streets, shootings made headlines, and the public grew both fascinated and horrified. Rothstein avoided the spotlight, but he could not avoid the ripples. When bombs went off in gang wars, when bootleggers killed each other over routes, his name sometimes surfaced in whispers. Was he behind it? Was he profiting? He never confirmed, never denied. He simply kept his distance and let others burn themselves out while he counted the profits. Still, the danger was real. The more powerful he became, the more enemies he collected. Some envied his wealth, others resented his cold detachment, and a few, reckless and foolish, thought they could outsmart him at his own games. It was poker that brought the most risk. Rothstein loved the game too much to ever walk away from it. Night after night, he sat at tables where money flowed like water. His opponents came in thinking they could beat him, thinking his reputation was exaggerated. They left lighter, often bitter, always humbled. But the game carried dangers beyond money. Pride was wounded at those tables. Resentment grew, and resentment in the underworld had a way of festering into violence. There were nights when Arnold leaned back, studying the smoke curling from his cigar, and wondered how long he could keep the balance. He had fixed the World Series, made millions from liquor, mentored the next generation of gangsters, and still walked the streets untouched. But the odds, the thing he had mastered all his life, could not always remain in his favor. Even the best gambler knew that eventually the cards turned cold. He began to sense it in small ways. Friends who once came eagerly to his table now hesitated. Business partners grew sharper in their negotiations, less deferential. Whispers followed him, questions about his involvement in certain deals, accusations about whether he had skimmed too much, doubts about whether his influence was slipping. He dismissed most of it. In his mind, envy was the tax a successful man paid. But envy has sharp edges. There was one night in particular that seemed to hang over him. He sat at a poker table in the Park Central Hotel, the air thick with smoke and tension. The stakes were high, tens of thousands of dollars. Rothstein was calm as always, his expression unreadable. But across from him sat men who were less composed, their frustration building with every hand. One of them muttered too loudly about being cheated. Another slammed his fist on the table, face flushed with drink. Rothstein didn't respond. He simply tapped ash from his cigar and played on. It wasn't the first time he had heard such accusations. To him, they were meaningless. The weak always blamed the strong when they lost. But that night, the bitterness felt heavier. The eyes on him were darker, colder. He sensed it, even as he smiled faintly and collected his winnings. Something had shifted. Outside the poker rooms, the city was no calmer. Prohibition violence climbed, and politicians began to feel pressure to act. Newspapers screamed about corruption, about gangsters growing rich while ordinary men struggled. Reformers demanded investigations. And while Rothstein kept himself insulated, even his name could not remain entirely hidden from the storm. He told himself it was all noise, that he had survived worse, that patience would see him through. But deep down, a part of him wondered if his time was drawing close. He had built an empire without ever firing a shot, but empires, like poker games, never lasted forever. For now, though, he carried on as if nothing had changed. He met Luciano for lunches, offered Lansky advice, arranged deals that moved liquor through the city. He attended the races, sat at poker tables, smoked his cigars. He looked like a man in control, untouchable, unshaken. And yet, if you looked closely, you might have seen the faintest shadow at the edge of his calm. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. The awareness that the cards were turning, that the odds were shifting, that even the brain could not outthink fate forever. The younger men admired him still, but some also saw his flaws. Luciano whispered to Lansky once, "He's too much in love with the game. That'll be his end." Lansky nodded. They respected him, learned from him, but they also understood that they would one day surpass him. Rothstein had taught them well, perhaps too well. And so, the stage was being set. Rothstein, calm and precise, still believed he could hold the city in his hand. But enemies circled closer, debts piled higher, and resentment simmered in the smoke-filled rooms where fortunes rose and fell. The man who had fixed the World Series, who had bankrolled Prohibition, who had mentored the next kings of crime, was walking into the final stretch of his game. The cards were being dealt. And this time, the brain might not like the hand waiting for him. The air in New York grew heavier as 1928 edged forward. The city was loud as ever, taxicabs honking through crowded avenues, neon signs glowing over speakeasies, jazz horns carrying deep into the night. But beneath the rhythm of modern life was a dangerous hum. Prohibition had not only poured rivers of liquor into the city, it had bred rivalries sharper than knives. Everyone wanted a share, and everyone wanted more than the man beside him. For years, Arnold Rothstein had navigated this chaos with calm precision, stepping lightly where others stomped, keeping his hands clean while men around him bled. But no man, not even the brain, could move through such a storm forever without feeling the spray. By now he was in his mid-40s, still immaculate in his dress, still steady in his manner. He walked into restaurants with the quiet dignity of a banker, a man who belonged wherever he chose to sit. To strangers, he looked like success itself. But for those who moved in the city's shadows, whispers followed him. He was in too deep with certain debts, some said. He was stretching himself thin, others claimed. For the first time in years, the confidence around his name wasn't absolute. Poker was at the center of it. It always had been. No matter how high he rose, no matter how much money he made in liquor, horses, or real estate deals, the game kept pulling him back. Poker was his vice, his obsession, his proving ground. And in the late months of 1928, it became his undoing. He had sat down at the Park Central Hotel, a regular haunt of his, to play in a series of high-stakes games. The money on the table wasn't just large, it was enormous. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, slid back and forth across those green felt tables. Rothstein, calm as ever, played his hands with patience. His face unreadable as smoke drifted in the air. But the cards didn't favor him, not this time. The odds, which he had trusted all his life, turned cold. Losses piled, he borrowed against future winnings, confident the tide would turn. It didn't. By the end of it, Rothstein owed more than $300,000, a staggering sum even for him. For a man who had built his empire on discipline and calculation, it was an uncharacteristic stumble. And worse, he refused to pay. "I don't recognize the debt," he told those who pressed him. The game wasn't honest. It was a dangerous claim. At that level of gambling, men's reputations were currency. To accuse others of cheating was to spit in their faces. Rothstein, usually so cautious with his words, had chosen defiance. Maybe he truly believed the game had been rigged. Maybe he was buying time, waiting to move money from another deal to cover the loss. Or maybe, for the first time in his life, the brain was cornered and didn't know how to play the hand. The men he owed weren't the sort to let insults slide. They were gamblers, bootleggers, gangsters, the kind of men who lived by pride as much as profit. To be cheated was one thing, to be called a cheat was another. Rothstein's calm refusal to settle his debt made enemies of men who had once respected him. And in New York's underworld, enemies rarely waited long before collecting. He carried on with his usual routine in the days that followed. He still walked into his favorite restaurants, still smoked his cigars, still met with the younger mobsters who came seeking his advice. To the casual observer, nothing seemed amiss. But behind the facade, the pressure grew. Quiet threats reached his ears. Warnings were delivered in tones more serious than usual. Friends urged him to settle, to pay, and be done with it. Arnold dismissed them. "I don't pay what I don't owe," he said. The arrogance of it stunned even his closest allies. For years, Rothstein had been the man who understood risk better than anyone. He knew when to fold, when to press, when to step back and wait. But here, with his life on the line, he refused to bend. Some thought it pride. Others thought it exhaustion, as if the long years of control had finally worn him down and he no longer cared to play the game. Whatever the reason, it was a miscalculation he could not afford. November came, and with it the end game. The leaves in Central Park had turned brown and brittle, the air sharp with the coming winter. On the afternoon of November 4th, 1928, Rothstein received word of a meeting. The men he owed wanted to speak. Perhaps, some thought, it was an offer to negotiate. Perhaps Arnold believed he could still talk his way clear, as he had so many times before. He dressed as neatly as ever, dark suit, polished shoes, silk tie, and left for the Park Central Hotel. The hotel was bustling, as it always was, filled with travelers, businessmen, and gamblers moving in and out of its grand lobby. Rothstein moved through it calmly, the way he always did, as if nothing in the world could shake him. He entered the suite where the meeting was to be held. What words were exchanged there, no one knows. What is certain is that voices were raised, tempers flared, and then a shot rang out. Rothstein staggered back, struck in the abdomen. The bullet tore through him, hot and merciless. He collapsed, but even in that moment he remained composed. Witnesses said he didn't scream, didn't beg. He simply pressed a hand to his wound and tried to rise, his face pale but steady. They rushed him to the hospital, doctors working frantically to save him. Lying on that bed, bleeding out, Rothstein was still the brain. Detectives pressed him for answers, desperate to know who had pulled the trigger. He could have named names, dragged his enemies down with him, but he refused. He stared at them with cold eyes and said nothing. The code he had lived by, never reveal too much, never show your hand, he carried with him to the end. 2 days later, on November 11th, 1928, Arnold Rothstein died at the age of 46. The bullet had done its work. The man who had fixed the World Series, who had bankrolled Prohibition, who had taught Luciano and Lansky the art of organized crime, was gone. The city reacted with a mixture of shock and inevitability. Newspapers splashed his name across headlines, recounting his career with equal parts fascination and disdain. Some called him a genius, others called him a parasite. Many wondered aloud how a man so careful, so brilliant, could have been brought down by something as ordinary as a gambling debt. But those who knew him best shook their heads. To them, it made perfect sense. Rothstein had lived by the game. In the end, it was the game that killed him. His funeral drew a strange crowd: politicians, gamblers, mobsters, businessmen. Men who would never admit publicly that they had known him stood silently at his graveside, hats in their hands. Luciano was there, eyes sharp with calculation. Lansky, too, his face unreadable. They mourned him, yes, but more than that, they understood what his death meant. A space had opened in New York's underworld, a vacuum that needed to be filled. They would fill it, and they would do so using the lessons Rothstein had taught them. The brain was gone, but his influence remained. The networks he had built, the methods he had pioneered, the philosophy of control without violence, all of it lived on in the men he had mentored. Organized crime in America would grow into something vast and enduring, and at its root would always be the quiet figure of Arnold Rothstein, the gambler who thought in probabilities, the man who believed everything had a price. In the end, his story was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph because he had risen higher than any gambler before him, shaping the very structure of modern crime. Tragedy because he could not escape his own weakness, the love of the game, the refusal to back down, the pride that would not let him pay. The city moved on, as it always did. But in the smoke-filled poker rooms, in the back alleys of speakeasies, in the whispers of gangsters planning their next move, his name lingered. Not as a cautionary tale, not entirely as a legend, but as something in between. Arnold Rothstein, the man who played the biggest game of all and finally lost. The night Arnold Rothstein died, New York did not fall silent. It never did. The city thrummed on as it always had, cabs rattling down avenues, radios buzzing in apartments, jazz horns spilling from smoky clubs. But inside the circles where his name mattered, a shadow passed. The brain was gone. And with him a strange calm that had always surrounded the city's most dangerous deals. He had been the quiet center in a storm of gang wars and prohibition profits. Without him, the air felt thinner, more volatile. At the Park Central Hotel, reporters swarmed, pens scratching furiously as rumors filled the corridors. The shooting was still fresh, the details still uncertain. Who had pulled the trigger? Was it George "Hump" McManus, the bookmaker accused of running the poker game Rothstein claimed was crooked? Was it one of the angry creditors who had grown tired of waiting? Or was it someone else entirely, another rival who saw in Rothstein's debts an opportunity to finish him? Detectives pressed for answers at his hospital bedside. Rothstein, pale and bleeding, held his composure even as the end drew near. "I won't tell you," he said flatly when asked who shot him. "I've lived by my own code, and I'll die by it." Those were the words that filtered out, repeated by policemen, repeated by journalists, repeated by gangsters in whispers. Even in death, he refused to fold. The funeral drew crowds that looked nothing alike but carried the same weight of power. There were businessmen in fine overcoats, lawyers, even a scattering of politicians who owed Rothstein more than they could ever admit. And then there were the mobsters, the young, hungry men who would carry his lessons into the future. Luciano stood near the back, hat low over his eyes, watching, listening. Lansky was there too, sharp and still, his thoughts hidden behind his small frame. To them, Rothstein had been more than a mentor. He had been proof that the underworld didn't need to look like an alley fight. It could wear a suit, smoke a cigar, and sit at the best table in the restaurant. The newspapers were less kind. Headlines branded him as the king of the gamblers, the man who had corrupted baseball, the financier of bootleggers, the mastermind of vice. The editorials seethed with righteous anger, painting him as a symbol of the decay prohibition had unleashed. Yet beneath the outrage, there was a grudging fascination. He had never fired a shot in public, never led a gang through the streets, never been caught in the bloody spectacle that marked so many of his contemporaries. He had lived like a businessman and died like a gambler. That paradox fascinated the public as much as it enraged them. The investigation into his murder dragged on, tangled and inconclusive. George McManus was arrested, accused of luring Rothstein to the hotel for a rigged game and then orchestrating the hit when Rothstein refused to pay. The newspapers pounced on the story, printing McManus's mugshot beside Rothstein's portrait in tailored suits. But in court, the case unraveled. Witnesses wavered, evidence was thin, and the silence of the underworld was impenetrable. McManus walked free, acquitted of the murder. Rothstein's killer was never definitively named. That was fitting in a way. Rothstein had lived in shadows, pulling strings behind curtains, never letting the public see the full shape of his power. It was almost poetic that his death should be left shrouded, unsolved. a mystery that mirrored the life he had chosen. The brain had always been a man who kept his secrets. Now, his last secret went with him to the grave. In the weeks that followed, the city adjusted quickly, as cities always do. But among the men he had influenced, something permanent shifted. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, they stepped forward into the vacuum. They had listened to Rothstein's teachings: patience over rage, influence over violence, money over muscle. They took those lessons and built something larger than even he had imagined. Luciano began organizing the city's gangs into something closer to a corporation, a structure that allowed profits to flow without constant bloodshed. Lansky turned numbers into an empire, building gambling operations that stretched beyond New York. Costello worked his charm in political circles, greasing the same palms Rothstein had once fed, but doing it with even greater reach. Each of them, in their way, carried a piece of Rothstein forward, but there was also a caution in their steps. They saw how he had fallen, not by bullets in a gang war, but by pride at a poker table. They whispered to each other that Rothstein had broken his own rule. He had always said patience was the gambler's greatest weapon, yet he had refused to wait, refused to compromise, refused to pay. His downfall was a reminder that even the sharpest brain could dull when pride got in the way. For the city, his death was a signal that the underworld was changing. The old image of gangsters as brawling thugs was fading. In its place was the new model: men who thought like Rothstein, who saw crime as enterprise, who treated bootlegging and gambling like investments instead of adventures. The brain had been the blueprint. His protégés would become the architects. In the quiet, though, there were personal losses. Carolyn Green, his wife, stood at his grave, her face unreadable to the reporters watching from a distance. Their marriage had been strained, built more on appearances than affection, yet she carried herself with dignity. She had lived in his shadow, surrounded by whispers, never fully part of his world and never entirely outside it. Now that world had swallowed him whole, and she was left to carry his name without the man behind it. Others who had owed him money or favors breathed easier. With Rothstein gone, debts dissolved, obligations vanished. But some whispered that losing him was no victory. For all his coldness, for all his detachment, Rothstein had been a stabilizing force. He had kept rivalries from exploding by controlling the money, by keeping debts and favors in balance. Without him, the scales tipped more easily, and violence spilled faster. The police, too, found themselves at a loss. They had long tolerated Rothstein, even respected him in their own way. He had been predictable, a man who could be bribed but who also knew when to step back, when to avoid chaos. The men rising to replace him were less cautious, less willing to compromise. For the law, as much as for the underworld, the brain's absence was a problem. As the months rolled on, his name faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new gang wars, new prohibition trials. But in back rooms, his ghost lingered. Men sitting at poker tables lowered their voices when they spoke of him. Young gangsters, eager to prove themselves, repeated his sayings like lessons from a book. Violence gets you enemies. Debt gets you servants. Luck runs out. Brains don't. These words lived longer than the man who spoke them. New York itself moved forward, hungry as ever. But for those who had known him, there was always a moment in the quiet between deals when they remembered the man in the tailored suit, the steady eyes, the calm voice that never rose, the hand holding a cigar as he counted odds no one else could see. Arnold Rothstein had been many things: gambler, financier, fixer, teacher, legend. In death, he became something else: the silent architect of an underworld that would outlive him by decades. And if, in the years that followed, baseball fans still whispered about the 1919 series, if gamblers still invoked his name with awe, if mobsters still measured themselves against his standard, that was the truest measure of his legacy. The brain was gone, but his game never ended. The newspapers didn't let him go quietly. In the weeks after his death, Arnold Rothstein's face appeared on front pages across the country, framed by bold headlines and sharp words. King of the gamblers shot down. The brain of Broadway dead at 46. Baseball's betrayer meets his end. For editors and reporters, Rothstein was too big a story to bury. His name had hovered in the margins of America's conscience for nearly a decade, whispered in connection to the 1919 World Series, muttered in stories about gambling dens and bootlegging networks. Now that he was dead, the papers could write freely, painting him as a symbol of everything corrupt in the new American century. They made him larger in death than he had been in life. Articles described him as the spider in a vast web, pulling threads that connected crime, politics, and sport. They called him a schemer without conscience, a man whose brain had been his weapon and whose greed had been his undoing. They relished the irony. A man who fixed games and debts had been undone by a debt of his own. The public devoured it. Some read the stories with satisfaction. Here was proof that crime didn't pay, that even the cleverest crook met his fate. Others read with awe, even envy, marveling at the reach of a man who had never needed to carry a gun. And still others read with unease, realizing that if men like Rothstein could fix baseball and outsmart the law for years, perhaps the world wasn't as honest as they wanted to believe. Baseball, especially, felt the weight of his shadow. The Black Sox scandal had scarred the sport in 1919, but Rothstein's death dragged the wound open again. Writers couldn't resist linking his end to that infamous fix, reminding readers that he had been the mastermind who turned America's pastime into a rigged show. Ballplayers were asked about him, owners muttered about the need for tighter controls, and fans argued in bars about whether the game had ever truly recovered. The legend of Rothstein clung to the sport like a bad smell, a reminder that purity was only ever an illusion. Beyond baseball, his name bled into the broader culture. On Broadway, where his money had often flowed, actors and stagehands whispered stories about him, the way he had sat in the audience with his calm eyes, the way producers sought his backing, the way showgirls were rumored to seek his attention. To them, he had been part of the city's fabric, a man who belonged as much to the nightlife as the theaters and the speakeasies. His death left a gap, and in that gap, myths began to bloom. Writers were quick to seize on his story. To the new generation of American novelists, he was irresistible. A gambler who fixed the World Series, who financed bootlegging, who lived like a businessman but died like a crook. It was the kind of tale that could be turned into metaphor, into allegory, into warning. F. Scott Fitzgerald, already at work shaping The Great Gatsby, would later weave Rothstein's likeness into the character of Meyer Wolfsheim, the shady, brilliant figure who fixed the World Series back in 1919. Rothstein lived on in literature, not as himself, but as a symbol, the quiet corrupter behind the curtain, the man who turned dreams into cons. In pool halls and backroom gambling dens, his name carried a different kind of echo. Old-timers told stories of playing against him, of watching him win without raising his voice, of the way he could ruin a man's confidence with nothing more than silence. Younger gamblers leaned in, hungry for details, eager to touch the legend. They repeated his sayings as if they were rules of nature. Luck runs out, brains don't. Violence gets you enemies, debt gets you servants. His philosophy spread like folklore, half truth and half warning, shaping the next generation of hustlers who wanted to be more than street thugs. But for all the glamour of his legend, the underworld itself grew sharper, harsher in his absence. Rothstein had been a stabilizer. His money kept rivals in check, his loans balanced out tensions, his quiet influence smoothed over the cracks. With him gone, debts that would once have been managed became causes for bloodshed. Small disputes escalated into open violence. Young gangsters, untempered by his discipline, lunged for power too quickly. The city grew louder, messier, more dangerous. Even the police felt the change. They had always tolerated Rothstein, uneasy as they were with his reach, but reassured by his restraint. He had been predictable, a man who paid when necessary, who avoided public chaos, who kept his violence out of sight. The men rising to replace him were less cautious. They carried guns openly, settled disputes with bullets instead of bribes. For detectives and politicians alike, the death of the brain was not a victory. It was the beginning of a more turbulent, more uncontrollable era. In cultural memory, though, Rothstein became a strange contradiction. To some, he was the villain who poisoned America's games and lined the pockets of criminals. To others, he was a genius who outsmarted a crooked system, a man who proved that brains could rule where brawn failed. He was condemned as a parasite and admired as a pioneer, sometimes in the same breath. Even his unsolved murder added to the legend. The fact that no one was ever convicted, that no one ever truly knew who fired the fatal shot, gave his story the flavor of myth. People debated it in bars, wrote about it in editorials, speculated about it in whispers. Was it McManus, furious at the unpaid poker debt? Was it a rival bootlegger eager to remove a powerful financier? Was it one of his own protégés tired of the leash? The lack of an answer turned the story into something more than history. It became folklore, the kind of mystery that lasts longer than truth. And in a way, that was the perfect ending for a man like Rothstein. He had lived by controlling appearances, by shaping perceptions, by keeping the truth just out of reach. His death did the same. The legend of the brain became bigger than the man himself, a story retold in countless versions, each shaded by the teller's bias. Years later, as organized crime grew more structured under Luciano and Lansky, they still spoke of him. They admitted his mistakes, his pride at the poker table, his refusal to bend when bending might have saved him. But they also credited him with showing them the path. Without Rothstein, they said, they might have remained street brawlers, small-time hustlers. With him, they had learned how to think like businessmen, how to build enterprises that could survive beyond the lives of the men who ran them. In that sense, his cultural echo was twofold. To the public, he was the face of corruption, the gambler who had fixed America's innocence. To the underworld, he was the architect, the teacher, the man whose philosophy built the foundations of modern organized crime. His influence stretched from the ballpark to Broadway, to the smoke-filled boardrooms where gangsters planned their empires. And through it all, one truth remained. Arnold Rothstein had never fired a shot, never swung a bat, never poured a drink in a speakeasy. Yet his fingerprints were everywhere. That was his genius, and that was his curse. In death, as in life, he remained the man behind the curtain, the quiet hand that shaped events, the gambler who turned odds into destiny. The city moved forward, as it always did. Prohibition raged on, gang wars escalated, fortunes rose and fell. But in every whispered story of a fixed game, in every rumor of a rigged race, in every cynical joke about politicians with dirty hands, the echo of his name remained. Arnold Rothstein, the man who proved that in America, even the purest dreams could be bought, sold, and rigged like any other game. In the months after Arnold Rothstein's death, the underworld of New York was like a chessboard without its king. Pieces moved erratically, pawns pushed forward too quickly, knights lunged without thought. The stabilizing hand that had kept the game balanced was gone, and in his absence, chaos threatened to swallow the board. But out of that chaos rose a new generation, young men who had learned their lessons at Rothstein's table, who understood that crime without structure was nothing more than waste. Charles "Lucky" Luciano was the most obvious heir. He had charm, ruthlessness, and ambition in equal measure. Unlike the older bosses who clung to old world traditions and ethnic loyalties, Luciano saw crime as business. Italians, Jews, Irish, it didn't matter, not if they could turn a profit together. This was Rothstein's philosophy at its core. Networks, not bloodlines, were what sustained power. Luciano had sat across from Rothstein enough times to understand the brilliance of building bridges instead of walls. Now, with the brain gone, he was determined to put that idea into practice. Meyer Lansky, the wiry Jew with calculating eyes, carried another piece of Rothstein's legacy. From him, Lansky had learned discipline, patience, the art of letting numbers dictate decisions rather than impulse. Lansky wasn't the kind to bark orders or demand respect through fear. He commanded by being the man who always knew the odds, who always had the right plan. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. It was Rothstein's way of thinking, distilled and sharpened in a younger body. And then there was Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld. From Rothstein, he had learned the subtle power of politics, of greasing palms and making friends in the right places. Costello didn't need to carry a gun because he carried influence. Judges, aldermen, police captains, they listened when he spoke, not because he threatened them, but because he could deliver votes, money, favors. He embodied Rothstein's belief that true power didn't come from the street, but from the connections that stretched into offices of law and government. Together, these men began to shape something bigger than the gang wars and bootlegging roots of prohibition. They began to shape an organization, a system, a government of the underworld. They didn't call it that yet, not openly, but the seeds of what would one day become the Commission were being planted in the years after Rothstein's death. At first, though, there was blood. With Rothstein gone, rival gangs tested boundaries, shooting spiked, bombs rattled tenements, bootleggers hijacked shipments, claiming territories by force. Luciano watched the old bosses, the mustache Petes of the Italian Mafia, cling stubbornly to their traditions, insisting that only Sicilians could rule, that alliances with Jews or Irish were weakness. He saw the same short-sightedness Rothstein had warned about, men too trapped in pride to see the larger game. Luciano, Lansky, and Costello played it differently. They built alliances across ethnic lines. They cut deals with Irish gangs, partnered with Jewish syndicates, and even found ways to work with rival Italian factions. They moved carefully, just as Rothstein had always done, using money and negotiation before violence. And when violence was necessary, they made sure it was decisive and final, not the kind of endless vendettas that drained resources. Bootlegging remained the backbone of their power. Shipments of Canadian whiskey and Caribbean rum flowed through warehouses guarded by men who now answered not to a single gang, but to an emerging network of partners. Trucks rumbled through city streets, police officers waved them through checkpoints, and the profits piled high. But unlike the reckless operators who blew their fortunes on flash and excess, Luciano and his circle reinvested. They bought into nightclubs, restaurants, even legitimate businesses. They paid off judges, funded political campaigns, and ensured their roots dug deep into the city's soil. Each step echoed Rothstein's lessons. He had shown them that crime could wear a suit, that it could sit at the best tables and pass for respectability. They followed his blueprint, refining it, expanding it, turning it from one man's brilliance into a system that could outlive them all. Still, there were reminders of what had happened to the brain. His death had been a warning. Pride could kill. Carelessness could kill. Even refusing to bend could kill. Luciano in particular carried that lesson close. He was ambitious, yes, but he was also pragmatic. If a debt needed to be paid to avoid a war, he paid it. If a compromise kept the money flowing, he made it. Unlike Rothstein, he wouldn't let principles stand in the way of survival. By 1931, the transformation was nearly complete. The bloody Castellamarese War had torn through the Italian underworld, pitting old-world bosses against ambitious young leaders. Luciano, guided by the same logic Rothstein had once whispered across poker tables, chose pragmatism over tradition. He betrayed his boss, Joe Masseria, and then double-crossed Salvatore Maranzano, ensuring that neither of the old guard would stand in his way. Out of the ashes, he formed the Commission, a governing body of the American Mafia, where leaders from different families sat together to resolve disputes and share profits. It was, in many ways, the realization of Rothstein's vision, a structure that brought order to chaos, that valued money over ego, that treated crime as enterprise rather than feud. Rothstein hadn't lived to see it, but his fingerprints were all over it. Luciano himself would later admit that the brain had been his greatest teacher. Meyer Lansky, meanwhile, expanded the reach of gambling, taking Rothstein's ideas and pushing them onto a national stage. He looked beyond New York, beyond prohibition, to places where gambling could flourish legally or illegally. He saw Las Vegas before it was Las Vegas. He built casinos in Havana before most Americans had ever thought of Cuba as a playground. He carried Rothstein's love of numbers and turned it into empires that stretched across borders. Costello, true to his nature, moved into politics so deeply that some called him untouchable. Judges dismissed cases against him. Police looked the other way. Legislators found themselves in his debt. He became what Rothstein had hinted at, but never fully achieved. A man who straddled the line between underworld and high society, welcomed in both, but fully belonging to neither. Together, these men proved that Rothstein had not lived in vain. His philosophy, his methods, his discipline, they outlived him, shaping organized crime in America for decades. Where others remembered him as a gambler brought down by pride, they remembered him as the man who taught them how to think, how to plan, how to build. And yet, even as they thrived, they never forgot the cautionary edge of his story. In late-night meetings, when cigars smoked and whiskey poured, his name would surface. Someone would mutter about his brilliance, someone else about his stubbornness. The lesson was always the same. No man, no matter how clever, was untouchable. The brain had fallen, and so could they. In that sense, Rothstein's true legacy was twofold. He had given them the tools to build empires, but he had also left them the warning that empires could collapse if pride outweighed patience. Luciano and Lansky, Costello and their allies, carried both halves forward, the brilliance and the caution, the vision and the shadow. The city moved on, skyscrapers climbing higher, radios buzzing louder, cars filling the streets. But in its veins, in the money that flowed from gambling, liquor, politics, and protection, Arnold Rothstein's ghost still moved. Not in headlines anymore, not in the public's imagination, but in the quiet structures of power he had inspired. The man himself was gone, but the machine he had envisioned was alive, bigger and stronger than ever. And every time Luciano sat at the head of the commission, every time Lansky counted casino profits, every time Costello shook a politician's hand, somewhere in the silence behind them was Rothstein's calm voice, reminding them that brains, not luck, ruled the game. The 1930s opened with a shudder. The stock market crash of 1929 tore through America like a storm, flattening fortunes overnight. Banks collapsed, factories shuttered, men lined streets in desperate search of work. The Great Depression had arrived, and with it came hunger, anger, and fear. For most of the country, it was ruin. For the underworld, it was opportunity. And woven into that underworld, though he had been dead for years, was the shadow of Arnold Rothstein. His protege carried him into the new decade like a ghostly advisor whispering in their ears. Charles "Lucky" Luciano was consolidating his control of New York, the commission in place as the governing council of organized crime. Meyer Lansky had spread gambling operations beyond the city, finding ways to squeeze profits from every corner of America's fascination with chance. Frank Costello had become the quiet bridge between crime and politics, his influence creeping into places Rothstein himself had once only brushed against. The Depression tested all of them. Prohibition had already created enormous revenue streams, but the collapse of the economy shifted demand. Ordinary men, ruined by layoffs and lost savings, sought escape wherever they could find it. They crowded into speakeasies, they gambled on horses, they bet at backroom card games. Vice became relief, and relief was something people would pay for even when they couldn't afford food. Luciano recognized the shift quickly. He had learned from Rothstein that desperation made men pliable. The Depression was an ocean of desperation, and into it he cast nets. Bootlegging continued, but gambling surged. Illegal lotteries, or numbers games, exploded in poor neighborhoods where pennies pooled into fortunes for those who controlled them. The Italians and Jews who had learned from Rothstein now ran these rackets with cold efficiency, turning scraps into empires. Meyer Lansky, more disciplined than most, understood the long-term potential. He had watched Rothstein treat gambling not as a vice, but as an industry, something to be structured, regulated, and expanded. In the Depression years, Lansky built on this philosophy. He made alliances with Harlem numbers runners, partnered with Cuban operators, and began dreaming of casinos not just as dens of vice, but as legitimate businesses wrapped in glamour. To him, the Depression was not a setback, but a rehearsal for a bigger stage. Costello thrived in a different way. With politicians under pressure from an angry public, the need for campaign money grew. Costello supplied it, quietly, efficiently, binding officials to him with debts they could never fully repay. He greased the machinery of government at a time when it was rusting, and in return, the law turned a blind eye to his operations. Rothstein had always preached the power of influence over violence. Costello made it doctrine, showing that even in the hardest of times, a politician's pocket could still be filled, and all of it bore Rothstein's fingerprints. Though he had been shot down at the Park Central Hotel in 1928, his way of thinking lived on. He had shown these men that order mattered more than chaos, that brains mattered more than luck, that crime could be dressed as business. The Depression might have broken other criminal networks, but it did not break Rothstein's disciples. They adapted, survived, and grew stronger because they remembered his lessons. The public, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile their suffering with the resilience of the underworld. Newspapers reported bread lines stretching for blocks, families losing homes, children going hungry. At the same time, they printed stories of gangsters in tailored suits, smoking cigars, driving new cars. It fueled both resentment and fascination. People despised the criminals, but also envied them. In a world where banks and businessmen had failed, the gangsters seemed almost more reliable. They offered loans, protection, even jobs, though always at a price. It was during these years that Rothstein's name began to take on an almost mythic quality. He was invoked not just as the man who had fixed the World Series, but as the prototype of the modern gangster businessman. Writers compared him to fallen Wall Street barons, arguing that he had been no more corrupt than the bankers who had gambled away the nation's wealth. Some even suggested that Rothstein had understood capitalism better than the so-called legitimate financiers. He had simply played the game without pretense. The underworld itself used his memory as a kind of scripture. Young gangsters who had never met him repeated his sayings as if they were gospel. Brains beat brawn. Every man has a price. Patience wins the game. These phrases circulated in smoky rooms, shaping behavior long after his death. When disputes broke out, older figures would remind the hot-headed, "Think like Rothstein. Don't spill blood if money can settle it." He had become less a man than a principal, a ghostly presence in the decision-making of men who now ruled the streets. But even as his philosophy endured, the Depression introduced new temptations, new dangers. Narcotics began to creep more openly into the trade. Heroin and cocaine moved through the same channels as liquor once had, promising high profits, but also high risks. Rothstein himself had dabbled in narcotics before his death, financing shipments and lending money to smugglers, but he had never allowed it to dominate his empire. His protégés debated whether to follow that path. Luciano, in particular, saw opportunity. Lansky hesitated, wary of the instability it brought. Costello leaned toward caution, preferring the safer profits of politics and gambling. Their debates reflected Rothstein's absence. When he had been alive, his word would have carried weight. His caution might have restrained ambition. Without him, they had to weigh his ghostly lessons against their own hunger. Luciano pushed forward, eventually helping shape the drug trade that would shadow organized crime for decades. Lansky and Costello held back, focusing on enterprises that seemed less likely to provoke collapse. Each choice carried pieces of Rothstein, but also departures from his path. The Depression years also showed the limits of respectability. Rothstein had always insisted on appearances, suits, manners, composure. Luciano and his circle mimicked this, presenting themselves as businessmen rather than thugs. But the public, ground down by poverty, grew less tolerant of the illusion. Hearings were held, investigations launched, judges thundered about cleaning up corruption. The law was no longer content with small bribes and quiet compromises. The system itself was under scrutiny, and crime, no matter how polished, was harder to disguise. Yet even here, Rothstein's influence could be seen. When Costello was dragged into hearings, he sat calmly, speaking respectfully, answering just enough to appear cooperative without ever giving anything away. Observers remarked on his composure, his discipline. It was Rothstein's demeanor, echoed years later, shielding another man from ruin. As the 1930s wore on, the Depression deepened, then slowly began to ease. Prohibition itself ended in 1933, stripping organized crime of its richest vein. But for Luciano, Lansky, and Costello, this was not a collapse. It was an evolution. They had diversified, invested, and adapted. Gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, politics. These filled the space alcohol once occupied. And in every new venture, they carried with them the ghost of the brain. By the mid-decade, when Luciano stood at the head of the commission, when Lansky was planting seeds in Havana and dreaming of Las Vegas, when Costello was shaking hands with senators, Rothstein was years in the ground. Yet his presence was everywhere. He had been the first to see that crime could be structured, the first to treat it as industry. The Depression had tested that structure and proven it sound. For the ordinary people of New York, his name faded from daily talk, replaced by the hunger of survival, the chatter of Roosevelt's New Deal, the hope of recovery. But for the underworld, his name remained a touchstone, a reminder of what brains could build and what pride could destroy. The Great Depression had ruined millions, but it had not ruined Rothstein's legacy. If anything, it had confirmed it. He had shown that in times of chaos, discipline and patience ruled. His protege, scarred but unbroken, carried that lesson forward into a future he would never see but had, in many ways, designed. The end of Prohibition in 1933 should have been a death blow to organized crime. For more than a decade, liquor had been the bloodstream of the underworld, pumping money into every racket, binding politicians and gangsters together in an economy of bribes, shipments, and speakeasies. With repeal, the taps were turned back to the legal breweries, and the gangs might have collapsed under their own weight. But they didn't. They adapted, quickly and efficiently, just as Arnold Rothstein would have expected. The repeal was, in truth, a test of how well his lessons had taken root. Rothstein had always warned that one enterprise could not last forever, that gambling on a single scheme was no better than betting all your chips on one card. Diversification was his religion, and the men he mentored had listened. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, they did not weep over lost bootlegging profits. They pivoted, each in his own way, carrying Rothstein's ghost into the new landscape of the 1930s. Luciano's genius was organization. Where others saw the end of an era, he saw the beginning of something bigger. Bootlegging had taught him how to manage networks of men, how to move products across borders, how to negotiate with rivals without endless bloodshed. Now, he applied that knowledge to other rackets, labor unions, construction contracts, and, increasingly, narcotics. It was dangerous territory, but Luciano understood what Rothstein had always implied. Vice never disappeared, it only changed form. If people could no longer drink illegally, they would gamble, they would crave drugs, they would pay for protection. The trick was to be waiting for them with open hands. Lansky followed a different path, more precise, more disciplined. Gambling had always been his obsession, and he saw in the end of Prohibition a chance to expand it. Speakeasies no longer needed to pour illegal whiskey, but they could still host card games, dice tables, and backroom betting. Lansky made deals with operators across the city, taking percentages without drawing blood. But his eyes were already elsewhere. He looked to Havana, to the Caribbean, to places where governments were pliable and casinos could thrive in the open. He looked to Las Vegas, a dusty desert town that seemed insignificant then, but which he already dreamed of transforming into the gambling capital of the world. These were not wild ambitions, they were cold calculations, the kind Rothstein would have admired. Costello, as always, played politics. With alcohol legal again, legitimate breweries and distilleries poured money into campaigns, lobbying, and legislation. Costello made sure gang money flowed alongside it. He strengthened his ties with Tammany Hall, courted police officials, and built influence that stretched well beyond the underworld. Where Rothstein had once been the quiet man in the back of the restaurant, Costello now became the quiet man in the politician's office. He had learned from the brain that influence mattered more than fear, and he wielded it with skill. The commission, formed by Luciano in 1931, was the clearest proof of Rothstein's legacy. It was a council of bosses from the major crime families designed to settle disputes and regulate operations. It turned the chaos of street wars into something resembling order, where money flowed instead of blood. The idea of such a structure, a boardroom for crime, was directly in line with Rothstein's philosophy. He had always believed in organization over anarchy, brains over brawn. Luciano had simply formalized it, creating a system that would outlast even him. The newspapers, meanwhile, continued to invoke Rothstein's name. Every time the commission flexed its power, every time a gambling ring was exposed, every time a trial revealed the depth of corruption, reporters linked it back to the brain. "This is the world Rothstein built," one columnist wrote in 1934. "He may be gone, but his fingerprints are on every racket in this city." To the public, he had become a ghost, haunting the modern age, proof that crime had grown from small-time thuggery into something systemic, something that looked disturbingly like business. The irony was that while Rothstein had never lived to see the commission, his protégés often invoked him when justifying their decisions. Lansky, in particular, was fond of reminding others at the table that Rothstein thought in decades, not days. It was a warning against rashness, a reminder to think beyond the next shipment, the next bet, the next fight. In a world where impulsive violence often destroyed men, Rothstein's ghost acted as a brake, pulling them back toward discipline. Yet for all his enduring influence, there was an edge of caution in how they remembered him. His death, over a poker debt, was never far from their minds. Luciano would sometimes mention it bluntly. He was smarter than all of us, but he forgot the rule: pay what you owe. Pride, they agreed, had killed him. Pride and his refusal to bend. That lesson became as much a part of his legacy as his brilliance. They admired him, but they also feared becoming him, cut down not in a grand war, but in a quiet room over cards. In the public imagination, Rothstein's legend grew larger, fueled by writers and artists who saw in him the perfect symbol of America's contradictions. The Great Gatsby had already immortalized him as Meyer Wolfsheim, the shady genius who fixed the World Series. Other works followed, each reshaping his image, sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a genius, sometimes as both. He became part of the mythology of the Jazz Age, standing alongside bootleggers, flappers, and jazzmen as an icon of a restless, corrupt era. But the underworld kept his memory sharper, less romantic. To them, he was not a symbol, but a blueprint. Every numbers racket, every casino deal, every political payoff bore his fingerprints. Luciano's commission, Lansky's casinos, Costello's politics, all of it flowed from the lessons Rothstein had planted. And as the mid-1930s unfolded, those lessons proved invaluable. The economy was still weak, reformers were still pushing for crackdowns, and rivalry still threatened to erupt. But the men who had learned from Rothstein knew how to keep balance, how to smooth edges, how to keep the money flowing even in crisis. By 1935, New York's underworld had changed almost completely from what it had been when Rothstein first began running poker games in back rooms. It was bigger, richer, and more disciplined. The days of chaotic street fights and petty hustles were fading, replaced by syndicates that operated like corporations. This was Rothstein's true legacy. Not the scandal of the World Series, not the unpaid poker debt that killed him, but the transformation of crime into enterprise. And yet, there was still an emptiness in his absence. For all their success, Luciano and Lansky and Costello still spoke of him with a strange mixture of reverence and regret. He had been their teacher, their financier, their example. They had surpassed him in reach, in wealth, in power, but none of them carried his peculiar calm, that cold, unflinching patience that had once unnerved the city. They had built empires on his foundation, but the man himself remained singular, irreplaceable. The city, of course, moved on. The Depression ground on, Roosevelt's New Deal reshaped politics, Broadway sparkled with new shows, and the first hints of war in Europe began to creep into headlines. Rothstein's name appeared less often in the papers now, replaced by new scandals, new trials, new murders. But in the hidden rooms, in the whispered conversations, in the way the underworld conducted itself, his presence remained. He had been gone less than a decade, and already his disciples were reshaping the city in his image. Organized crime was no longer just about liquor or gambling. It was about systems, networks, influence. It was about outthinking the law, not just outrunning it. That was Rothstein's gift, his curse, his inheritance to the men who had sat at his tables. And as the 1930s pressed forward, as crime became more organized, more corporate, more enduring, one truth remained clear. Arnold Rothstein was not just a man of his time. He was the architect of what came after. His death had ended his game, but his lessons ensured the game itself would never end. The 1930s were cruel to most Americans, but to stories, they were generous. Out of the lean years of the Depression came a hunger for myths, figures larger than life, villains and heroes who explained the chaos of the world. Gangsters, in particular, fascinated the public. They were both despised and admired, condemned as parasites, yet envied for their power and defiance. Newspapers filled with their exploits, Hollywood filmed their likenesses, and Broadway whispered their names. In that new wave of culture, the ghost of Arnold Rothstein lingered, reshaped, retold, and magnified, until he was no longer merely a dead gambler, but a legend of the American imagination. The newspapers had started the work, of course. In the immediate aftermath of his death, they painted him as the king of the gamblers, the spider in the center of the web. But as years passed, their tone shifted. By the mid-1930s, when the sting of the Black Sox scandal had dulled and the bootleggers' violence seemed more pressing, Rothstein's story was remembered with a mixture of awe and nostalgia. He was different, old reporters said in smoky bars. He wasn't like the thugs with machine guns. He was smooth, a gentleman crook. That phrase, gentleman crook, caught on. It was easier to sell to readers than the reality of a man who had exploited weakness with cold precision. Writers seized on him almost immediately. The most famous example, of course, was F. Scott Fitzgerald, who had already immortalized him in 1925 as Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby. Wolfsheim, with his cufflinks made from human molars and his casual boast about fixing the World Series, was a thin disguise for Rothstein. Readers in 1930s breadlines might not have known every detail of the real man, but they recognized the type. The shadowy figure who pulled strings behind the scenes, who corrupted the very symbols of American purity. Fitzgerald's novel only grew in fame after Rothstein's death, and in the minds of many, Wolfsheim and Rothstein blurred into one. Other writers followed, short stories, pulp magazines, and serialized crime dramas borrowed pieces of him. Sometimes the calm gambler, sometimes the fixer who never dirtied his hands, sometimes the man who fell over a debt he refused to pay. He became a character type as much as a historical figure, the brains behind crime in a world of brawn. Playwrights in New York used him as inspiration for figures in backstage dramas, hinting at the money men who lurked just beyond the stage lights, financing productions with winnings from poker and dice. Hollywood, too, couldn't resist. By the early 1930s, gangster films were booming. Little Caesar, 1931, The Public Enemy, 1931, and Scarface, 1932, put mobsters on the big screen with shocking intimacy. Though these films leaned more toward violent, flashy characters like Capone, the quieter figure of Rothstein haunted their shadows. When screenwriters needed a fixer, a financier, a man who didn't shoot but who planned, they drew on Rothstein's memory. His influence slipped into composite characters, shaping the image of the big boss who never held the gun but always decided where it pointed. Broadway carried his ghost more directly. Rothstein had always loved the theater, investing in productions, courting showgirls, sitting in the audience with his calm eyes. After his death, stories about his backstage dealings turned into gossip, and gossip turned into plays. Some shows hinted at the mysterious financier who made stars and then discarded them. Others used his name outright, drawing audiences who wanted to peek at the life of the infamous gambler. In smoky dressing rooms and crowded rehearsal halls, actors and dancers still told stories of him, how he once covered an entire payroll to save a show, how he slipped cash to a chorus girl, how he bet on whether an opening night would flop. Truth and fiction blurred until Rothstein became almost a character in the city's theater scene, even in absence. For ordinary Americans struggling through poverty, his story carried a strange allure. Here was a man who had outsmarted the system, who had lived in luxury while bankers collapsed and workers starved. They cursed him as a cheat, but they also admired him as someone who had refused to play by the rules that had betrayed them. In barbershops and saloons, men argued, was Rothstein a criminal, or was he simply more honest than the Wall Street gamblers who had ruined the country? The line between gangster and businessman was thin in the 1930s, and Rothstein's ghost walked it perfectly. Baseball, though, never forgave him. Every mention of the Black Sox scandal dragged his name back into the headlines. Commissioners, owners, and sports writers treated Rothstein as the devil who had nearly destroyed the game. In speeches about integrity, his name was invoked as the warning of what unchecked corruption could do. For fans, he became a shorthand for betrayal, the gambler who had sold out America's pastime. Children grew up hearing his name in the same breath as scandal, taught that he was the man who proved even baseball could be bought. This duality, admired in culture, reviled in sport, only deepened the myth. He was not remembered cleanly, as hero or villain, but as both at once. That ambiguity fascinated people. He became the man you could never quite pin down, the gambler who played with America itself and walked away until fate caught him. Even in the underworld, his legend became larger than his life. Luciano, Lansky, and Costello carried him like scripture, invoking his name when younger gangsters grew reckless. "Remember Rothstein," they would say when someone bragged too loudly or took too bold a risk. His fall was the parable they repeated. A man could outthink everyone else and still die over a debt. But his brilliance, too, was remembered. The commission itself, the great table where crime families sat as businessmen rather than killers, was seen as Rothstein's spirit made flesh. His face wasn't at the table, but his ideas were. As the decade wore on and war clouds gathered in Europe, Rothstein's story became part of the cultural wallpaper of America. His death had been nearly a decade past, but his ghost was everywhere, in novels and plays and gangster films, in the whispered advice of mobsters, in the warnings of baseball commissioners. He was no longer just a man. He was a myth that America used to explain itself, a mirror of its ambition and its corruption. And myths have a way of outliving facts. The real Rothstein had been meticulous, calculating, disciplined. The myth Rothstein became was smoother, darker, more dramatic. He was painted as both more ruthless and more charming than he truly was, because that was what audiences wanted. His poker face became a mask for all of America's contradictions, its love of wealth, its suspicion of power, its hunger for stories of men who rose above the rules and paid for it. By the end of the 1930s, his legend was secure. Children who had been too young to remember his name in headlines now knew it from novels and movies. Gangsters who had never shaken his hand still swore by his sayings. Writers, reporters, and politicians still invoked him when they wanted to explain corruption, ambition, or betrayal. Rothstein had become what he always wanted to be, unforgettable. The man had died in a hotel room over a poker debt. But the myth, the calm genius, the gentleman crook, the architect of modern crime, lived on, reshaped with every telling, a ghost woven into the fabric of America. The 1940s dawned with war. Europe was already burning, and by the end of 1941, the United States was fully drawn into the fight. Factories roared with production, young men vanished into uniforms, and cities like New York braced for the strain of blackouts, rationing, and uncertainty. In the chaos of global war, the American underworld found new ways to operate, and once again, Arnold Rothstein's ghost hovered over it all. He had been dead more than a decade, but his disciples now carried his blueprint into a world reshaped by conflict. For Lucky Luciano, the war was both a danger and an opportunity. Arrested in 1936 on vice charges and sentenced to decades in prison, his empire might have withered in his absence. But Luciano had learned Rothstein's lessons well. Influence mattered more than presence. Even behind bars, his reach extended. When the U.S. Navy feared sabotage on the New York docks, it quietly turned to Luciano's network for help. In exchange for cooperation, his sentence was reduced, and eventually, he was deported to Italy. It was a deal Rothstein would have admired, brains outmaneuvering brute force, the law itself bent into service. Meyer Lansky, meanwhile, became the quiet architect of wartime underworld enterprise. Gambling remained his obsession, but the war added new layers. Soldiers on leave craved entertainment, and Lansky's establishments provided it, raking in profits from cards, dice, and betting. He also forged deeper ties to Cuba, using Havana as a playground for both Americans and Europeans. The island, with its lax laws and pliable politicians, was a Rothstein-style paradise. Money could buy anything, and discipline could make it last. Lansky applied the brains philosophy with surgical precision, expanding beyond New York while keeping his profile low. Frank Costello thrived most of all. While other mobsters chased bootlegging or fought bloody battles, Costello turned politics into his weapon. The war had made government bigger than ever. Contracts, rationing, regulations, and Costello's influence seeped through it all. He learned to shape policy by shaping the men who wrote it. Senators, governors, even judges leaned on him quietly for funds, advice, or connections. Costello was, by the 1940s, what Rothstein might have become had he lived longer. A figure who looked more like a businessman than a gangster, moving in circles of power with a calm smile. Through each of them, Rothstein's ghost was present. His insistence on patience, on calculation, on influence over violence, all of it guided them as they adapted to wartime America. The Depression had proven his methods durable. The war proved them universal. No matter the circumstance, economic collapse or global conflict, the philosophy held, crime could thrive if it behaved like business. Outside the underworld, his myth continued to grow. Wartime America was hungry for distraction, and Hollywood delivered. Gangster films flourished, often softened to fit wartime censors, but still crackling with the same fascination for men who lived by their own rules. Characters modeled on Rothstein appeared again and again. The calm fixer, the man in the suit who didn't fire the gun but who decided when it should be fired. He had become an archetype, so deeply woven into the genre that audiences recognized him without needing his name. Literature, too, kept his legend alive. Crime novels of the 1940s borrowed his traits: discipline, intellect, cold patience. Writers who had read about him as boys now folded him into their stories as men. He became shorthand for the mastermind, the brain behind every scheme. When critics described fictional gangsters as Rothstein types, the meaning was instantly clear. Even Broadway kept him alive. Plays set in the underworld leaned on his reputation, invoking his name in dialogue or shaping characters around his myth. Audiences, many of whom remembered the Black Sox scandal or his dramatic death, leaned forward when his ghost flickered across the stage. He was still, in their minds, the man who proved that America's games, whether baseball or politics, could be bought. But in the underworld itself, his absence was felt in sharper ways. The 1940s were an age of expansion, but also of risk. Narcotics grew as a trade, and with it, came instability. Rothstein had always been cautious about drugs, too volatile, too unpredictable. Luciano and his allies, desperate for profits to replace lost bootlegging revenue, leaned into it more heavily. Some remembered the brain's warnings, muttering that he would never have allowed narcotics to dominate. Yet ambition carried them forward, and with ambition came blood. Still, his discipline lingered as a guiding star. Lansky, especially, seemed almost haunted by Rothstein's memory. He refused to let violence dominate his enterprises, preferring negotiation, percentages, and quiet deals. In Havana, he built casinos that gleamed with respectability, inviting tourists and politicians alike to gamble without fear. It was pure Rothstein. Vice dressed as entertainment, profit wrapped in polish. Costello, too, carried the ghost in his manner. When asked once how he avoided the fate of so many loud, violent bosses, he shrugged. "Arnold showed me the way," he said. "Don't raise your voice, don't raise your gun. Raise your glass and raise your hand in the right office." It was almost a creed, passed down from the brain to his disciples, shaping the very culture of organized crime. And yet, Rothstein's cautionary tale remained just as powerful as his lessons. Whenever debts went unpaid, whenever tempers flared, whenever pride threatened to undo a deal, someone would mutter, "Remember Rothstein." The younger gangsters, who only knew his story through legend, learned it as law. No one was untouchable, not even the brain. By the late 1940s, with the war over and America entering a new boom, Rothstein's ghost felt strangely modern. Corporate America was expanding. Suburban life was beginning, but the underworld still mirrored his ideas. Syndicates operated like companies, with hierarchies, divisions, and profits. The commission met like a board of directors. Casinos and racetracks thrived as if they were simply branches of finance. Rothstein had died in 1928, but the world he imagined, crime as enterprise, was fully alive. The public still spoke his name, though now it carried a different edge. Older generations remembered him as Scandal, the man who betrayed baseball. Younger ones knew him as Legend, the prototype of every gangster story they consumed. Writers continued to borrow him, filmmakers continued to shape him, gangsters continued to invoke him. Few men, dead almost 20 years, could claim such an enduring shadow. He had been one man with a gambler's patience and a financier's mind. Yet by the 1940s, he was more than that. He was an idea. The idea that brains could build empires, that respectability could cloak corruption, that vice could be dressed as business. An idea that survived depression, survived war, and prepared to shape the decades still to come. And so, while the world celebrated victory in 1945, while soldiers came home and families reunited, Rothstein's ghost lingered in the background. In Havana casinos, in New York backrooms, in the polished smiles of politicians shaking Costello's hand, in the cold calculations of Lansky's gambling tables, he was still there. Dead for nearly 2 decades, but alive in every deal, every payoff, every quiet nod between men who understood that power came not from fists, but from patience. Arnold Rothstein was gone, but the 1940s proved beyond doubt his game was not. The 1950s opened with a glitter America hadn't seen in decades. The war was over, the economy was booming, suburbs spread like fresh paint across the land, and televisions flickered in living rooms with images of prosperity. But behind the chrome cars and white picket fences, another empire was thriving. Casinos, rackets, unions, and politics, all tied together by men who had once sat at Arnold Rothstein's tables. Though he had been dead more than 20 years, the world of organized crime in the 1950s was in many ways the world he had imagined. Las Vegas, that dusty desert outpost, became the clearest expression of his ghost. Before the war, it had been little more than a curiosity, a town with legalized gambling and not much else. But in the post-war years, it transformed into a neon oasis, fueled by the very philosophy Rothstein had pioneered. Crime disguised as business, vice cloaked in glamour. Meyer Lansky was at the heart of it. He didn't build Vegas himself, but his fingerprints were everywhere. He advised, he financed, he connected men with the money to men with the muscle. Every casino that opened, glittering with lights, promising escape and fortune, was, in some way, a child of Rothstein's idea that gambling wasn't a backroom hustle, but an industry. Tourists came in droves. Middle-class families, flush with post-war savings, drove across the desert to see the shows, spin the roulette wheel, and sip drinks under chandeliers. They thought they were stepping into legitimate entertainment. They didn't know, or pretended not to know, that behind the dealers and the showgirls were mobsters who counted profits in smoky backrooms. It was Rothstein's great illusion, perfected, crime so polished that people paid eagerly to be part of it. Havana played a parallel role. While Vegas was still young, Cuba was already thriving as a playground for Americans, and Lansky turned it into his personal jewel. Casinos lined the Malecón, dripping with money and politics. He forged alliances with Cuban leaders, ensuring protection, and built establishments where wealthy tourists and powerful politicians rubbed shoulders. Havana was everything Rothstein would have adored, a place where money bought silence, where appearances masked corruption, where gambling and politics danced together openly. Frank Costello thrived in this era too. He had become so entwined with politics that he was known not just as a gangster, but as the Prime Minister of the underworld. Judges, senators, even governors took his calls. He didn't need to brandish threats. His influence was his weapon. Costello had taken Rothstein's lesson. That influence was stronger than violence, and refined it into an art. He played golf with the powerful, hosted dinners, whispered advice. To the public eye, he was respectable enough to move among them. To the underworld, he was untouchable. But the 1950s also brought a new kind of scrutiny. Television, that new glowing box in every living room, began to carry images of hearings and trials directly into American homes. Crime was no longer just newspaper ink or whispered gossip. It was live theater for the masses. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1950 and 1951 dragged organized crime into the spotlight. Senators thundered about corruption, mobsters paraded before cameras, and America stared into the face of the empire Rothstein had built. Costello became one of the hearing's most infamous figures. Millions of Americans watched him on live television, refusing to answer questions, his calm voice steady as he invoked the Fifth Amendment again and again. At one point, when pressed about his influence on politics, he muttered, "I never stole a nickel from anyone." The line became infamous, a symbol of his mix of denial and arrogance. But what most Americans didn't realize was that they were watching Rothstein's philosophy on display. Costello's composure, his refusal to break, his calm insistence on dignity, it was pure Rothstein, carried forward a generation. The Kefauver hearings revealed to the public what insiders had long known. Crime was no longer just about gangs and guns. It was systemic, organized, structured like business. Casinos, unions, construction, politics. It was all part of one web. And though Rothstein's name wasn't spoken often, his ghost lingered in the room. He had been the first to envision crime on that scale, the first to treat it as enterprise. What the Senate was uncovering in 1950 was, in truth, the system he had pioneered. At the same time, the cultural myth of Rothstein deepened. Hollywood's gangster films shifted tone in the 1950s, moving from the violent rise and fall stories of the 1930s to more nuanced psychological tales. Film noir, with its shadows and cynicism, found in Rothstein's legend the perfect archetype, the calm manipulator, the man who controlled outcomes without raising his voice. Characters modeled on him appeared again and again, suited, soft-spoken men whose brains were deadlier than bullets. Novels of the era echoed this too. Writers who had grown up hearing about the Black Sox scandal retold it in fiction, blending fact and rumor. Rothstein became less a man and more a symbol, the corrupting force behind American dreams, the gambler who proved that everything, even innocence, had a price. In pulp magazines, he was painted darker, almost demonic, the spider who spun webs around ballplayers and politicians alike. In literary works, he was painted with more nuance, a tragic figure undone by pride. Either way, his story refused to die. Baseball still cursed his name. Even decades later, the Black Sox scandal was invoked whenever questions of corruption arose. Sports writers, reflecting on the purity of the game, pointed to Rothstein as the man who had almost destroyed it. He remained the villain in baseball's mythology, the reminder that money could poison even America's pastime. Children who never knew his name from crime stories knew it from baseball lore. Arnold Rothstein, the gambler who sold out the World Series. In the underworld, though, his name carried different weight. Luciano, deported to Italy but still powerful, spoke of him with admiration. Lansky, running casinos and dreaming of global empires, often invoked him when younger associates grew reckless. Costello, even under the heat of televised hearings, carried himself with Rothstein's calm. His protégés were aging now, but each carried a piece of the brain. The lesson of his death remained too. No matter how high they rose, no matter how much money they made, they never forgot that Rothstein had been killed over a debt he refused to pay. His brilliance was their foundation, but his pride was their warning. In smoky backrooms, they still muttered, "Remember Rothstein," whenever disputes threatened to spiral. By the late 1950s, America was changing again. Suburbs swelled, consumerism exploded, and crime itself grew more sophisticated. Vegas boomed, Havana glittered, and the Commission continued to rule in the shadows. But Rothstein's presence was still felt. He was the prototype, the blueprint, the ghost that whispered in every deal. He had been gone nearly 30 years, yet his philosophy still ruled. Crime must look like business, money must outweigh violence, and patience was the sharpest weapon of all. For ordinary Americans, his name surfaced in different ways: books, films, baseball lore. For mobsters, it surfaced in meetings and memories. For politicians, it surfaced as a cautionary whisper whenever they took money from men they pretended not to know. His body had been lowered into the ground in 1928, but by the 1950s, Arnold Rothstein was everywhere, in culture, in crime, in the uneasy marriage of business and vice that defined mid-century America. He had fixed the World Series, bankrolled Prohibition, mentored the men who built Vegas and Havana. He had died over a poker debt, pride his final wager. And yet, his influence outlived him, shaping the mid-century world as surely as the neon lights of Vegas shaped the desert night. Arnold Rothstein was gone, but in the 1950s, his ghost was not fading. It was growing brighter, reflecting back from casinos, hearings, novels, films, and whispered lessons. The man who once sat silently at poker tables now sat, invisibly, at America's table, his calm eyes watching as the game rolled on. The story of Arnold Rothstein is not just the story of one man. It is the story of America itself, its ambition, its contradictions, its brilliance, and its corruption. When he was gunned down in a Park Central hotel suite in 1928, it might have seemed like the end of a gambler's tale, a lesson in hubris. But what followed in the decades after his death proved that his life had been less a single story than the opening chapter of something far larger. By the time the 1950s closed, his ghost had touched baseball Broadway, Wall Street, Las Vegas, Havana, Washington, and every smoky backroom where men counted money and weighed odds. Rothstein began as the boy who played marbles and learned that people's weaknesses mattered more than luck. He ended as the man who taught America that crime could be structured, that vice could be dressed in silk and carried in briefcases. He didn't carry guns or shout orders, but he changed the very shape of the underworld. In a time when thugs fought for scraps on street corners, Rothstein looked higher. He saw networks, industries, empires. His gift was vision, the ability to treat crime not as chaos but as business, and his students carried that vision further than he could have dreamed. Luciano's commission gave the Mafia a governing body, an institution as durable as any corporation. Lansky turned gambling into a global enterprise, planning casinos in Havana, dreaming of Las Vegas long before the neon lit the desert. Costello slid so deep into politics that senators shook his hand while pretending not to know who he was. Each of them admitted, in their own way, that they had learned from Rothstein. He had not only financed them, but taught them how to think. Without him, organized crime in America might have remained fragmented gangs, trapped in endless wars. With him, it became a syndicate, a machine, an economy. The irony, of course, is that Rothstein himself never lived to see that future. He died over a poker debt, stubborn and unbending to the end. Pride, not bullets, was his downfall. To the men who inherited his lessons, that pride was the warning they repeated. Remember Rothstein, they would say, when a partner grew arrogant, when a man refused to compromise. His brilliance gave them their foundation, but his downfall gave them their caution. That duality, genius and hubris, was the core of his legacy. Beyond the underworld, his influence spread into culture like ink in water. Fitzgerald made him immortal in The Great Gatsby as Meyer Wolfsheim, the fixer who corrupted the national pastime. Noir films of the 1940s and 1950s filled their shadows with men modeled on him, the calm manipulator, the gentleman crook who never dirtied his hands. Broadway whispered his name in plays, novels carried his image, pulp magazines turned him into a villain, and baseball cursed him forever. To baseball fans, he remained the villain who sold out innocence. Every scandal, every accusation of rigged games brought his ghost back to life. Children in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s grew up hearing that it was Rothstein who had nearly destroyed the game, Rothstein who proved that even heroes could be bought. He was the symbol of betrayal, the man whose shadow lingered over the diamond. To the public at large, though, he became something stranger, a symbol of both corruption and brilliance. In the Depression, he was compared to Wall Street gamblers, painted as proof that the lines between banker and gangster were thin. In wartime, he appeared as the archetype of the calm mastermind in stories and films. In the booming 1950s, as Vegas rose and Havana glittered, his ghost seemed almost prophetic, the man who had seen the future before anyone else. He became, in cultural memory, both a crook and a prophet. That is the paradox of Rothstein. He corrupted, but he also created. He betrayed, but he also built. He was hated and admired, condemned and envied, cursed and studied. He became whatever America needed him to be, a villain when it wanted purity, a genius when it wanted explanation, a myth when it wanted stories. What made him endure wasn't just what he did. The World Series fix, the bootlegging, the loans, the poker games. It was how he did it. Quietly, patiently, always with the calm of a man who believed he was 3 steps ahead. That composure, that poker face, became his true legacy. It shaped Luciano, Lansky, Costello, and through them, an empire that stretched across the 20th century. It shaped literature, film, and the very way Americans imagined organized crime. By the 1960s, Rothstein had been dead for more than 30 years. His name no longer appeared in daily headlines, but his ghost was everywhere. It sat at the commission table when bosses carved up territories. It haunted casinos in Havana and Vegas, where gamblers bet fortunes under chandeliers. Whispered through Senate hearings on organized crime. It glimmered in novels and films, in stories told by men who never met him but lived in the world he had made. Even his death, violent, stubborn, unresolved, became part of the myth. The fact that no one was ever convicted, that he died refusing to name his killer, turned him into legend. To the underworld, it was proof of his discipline. He died the way he lived, revealing nothing. To the public, it was proof of his corruption, the spider's web so tangled that even murder couldn't untangle it. And so his life, cut short at 46, stretched far beyond his years. In every poker game, in every fixed race, in every casino deal, his ghost lingered. In every novel about corruption, in every film about gangsters, in every whisper about politics and money, his shadow stretched. Arnold Rothstein was not simply a man. He was an idea. The idea that crime could be rational, that corruption could be systemic, that power could be patient. The final irony is that Rothstein himself never wanted to be remembered as a gangster. He wanted to be remembered as a businessman, as a man of refinement and calculation. And in a way, he succeeded. For while the world called him criminal, the underworld called him teacher. And teachers live longest in the lessons their students carry. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, they built on his foundations. Vegas, Havana, the Commission, they were his monuments. Fitzgerald, noir films, baseball's curse, they were his myths. And in all of it, in every strand of culture and crime, his presence remains. Arnold Rothstein, the boy with marbles, the man with the calm eyes, the brain who fixed the series and taught crime to think, played the biggest game of all. He lost his life in it, but the game he shaped never ended. And perhaps that is the truest measure of his legacy. He proved that a man could die, but an idea as sharp as his, could play on forever.